Hey everyone, my name's Katizi, and this is my Toxic Rain / Caustic Arrow Deadeye build guide. This is my favorite build. I've played it for pretty much all of Harvest and all of Heist League, and today I'd like to share how I build it along with some tips and tricks. This guide will be primarily oriented towards SSF players. That being said, let's quickly talk about the pros and the cons. The main pro is that this build is, well, exceptional in SSF. The build is fully functional with only cheap rares. The build can also do all content and all map mods with high speed. Additionally, this build is exceedingly easy mode, and using Toxic Rain trivializes much of the content in the game. The main con, however, is that at the end of the day, this is still a ranger character, and that means the character is quite squishy. Caustic Arrow fires a single arrow which explodes on hit to leave a puddle which deals damage over time. The damage over time puddle deals high damage but does not overlap with other puddles. Also, every time Caustic Arrow pierces, forks, or chains, it will leave a new puddle. Caustic Arrow's damage over time is scaled with the following modifiers. It is important to note that only projectile damage specifically increases Caustic Arrow's damage over time. Modifiers that affect projectile attack damage or projectile hit damage will not scale Caustic Arrow's damage over time. Toxic Rain fires 5 arrows which each leave a pod on the ground which deals damage over time to each enemy around it. After a short duration, the pods explode to deal area damage. This build focuses specifically on scaling the damage over time aspect. Toxic Rain's damage over time is scaled with exactly the same modifiers as Caustic Arrow, but are scaled with a couple more. Increased attack speed allows more pods to remain on the ground at one time. Area of effect increases pod damage over time radius, therefore increasing single target damage, but does not affect the overall size of where the pods land. Skill effect duration increases the total time the pods remain on the ground, increasing single target damage. Additional arrows fired increases the overall area where the pods land, but not each individual pod's damage over time radius. Theoretically, this increases the overall AoE of the skill, but does not increase single target damage. However, in small confined areas where the arrows are forced to land in a small area, additional arrows fired does definitely increase single target damage. So, what's the best Ascendancy? I say that it comes down to personal preference. I've played TRCA Trickster, Pathfinder, and Deadeye and can say that each build was viable and equally capable of doing all content. Trickster gives the most damage and defense, but doesn't give area of effect. Pathfinder gives good damage and area of effect, but doesn't give much utility. Deadeye gives decent damage and area of effect, but no defensive bonuses. However, Deadeye does give +1 arrow and chain, which offers a lot of utility when it comes to both Caustic Arrow and Toxic Rain. I personally really like that, which is why Deadeye is my favorite out of the three. For Caustic Arrow, these are the gem links from best to worst. Caustic Arrow, Vicious Projectiles, Concentrated Effect, Damage on Full Life, Swift Affliction, and Fork. Optionally, you can also use Empower at level 3 or 4, Void Manipulation, Chain Support, or Efficacy. Against single targets, you should probably swap out Fork Support for Void Manipulation. Another interesting thing to mention is Chain. Chain actually increases your damage by 20% more because of Deadeye's Ascendancy, Ricochet, which states, projectiles deal 10% more damage for each remaining chain. Another thing to mention is that, in my opinion, you should never run Arrow Nova support. Arrow Nova support decreases your damage significantly while not increasing your clear speed significantly. Instead of running Arrow Nova support, Consider running fork support or chain support instead if you want faster mapping. For Toxic Rain, the links are ordered best to worst, Toxic Rain, Mirage Archer, Vicious Projectiles, Efficacy, Damage on Full Life, and Void Manipulation. Optionally, you can also use Empower at level 3 or 4, and Swift Affliction. For auras, we're going to be using Malevolence to get damage over time and skill effect duration. We're going to be using Flesh and Stone in Sand Stance to blind nearby enemies, reducing their chance to hit by 50%, and also taking less damage from enemies that are far away. Finally, we're going to be using Clarity. The level of Clarity is flexible. You can run it at level 1, or you can raise the level depending on how much mana reservation you have. And then optionally, we link all auras to Enlighten. The next link is a Wither Totem. In this link you have Wither, Faster Casting, Spell Totem Support, and Multiple Totem Support. This allows you to put down a total of 3 totems, each of which cast Wither. Wither is a debuff which stacks up to 15 times. Each stack increases chaos damage taken by 6%. At maximum stacks, you get a total of 90% increased chaos damage taken on an enemy. This is exceptionally useful to take down bosses and other tanky enemies. For movement, we're going to be using Dash and Second Wind. Optionally, you can also use Phase Run. I personally really like using Phase Run because it allows you to move faster when there's nothing happening on the screen. For cast when damage taken, we're going to be running cast when damage taken at level 1, so it can trigger as often as possible, and then we're going to be running Immortal Call at level 3. This means that as soon as we take 528 or more damage, Immortal Call pops, causing 26% less physical and elemental damage taken. This greatly prevents the chance that you die to 2 shots or 3 shots or a bunch of shots hitting you at once. Optionally, you can also add into the cast when damage taken link Steel Skin at level 10. Steel Skin creates a buff that prevents you from taking damage. You could link all of this to increase duration to increase the duration that Steel Skin and Immortal Call is protecting you. With regard to random utility gems that you could run Val Haste, Val Grace, and Increased Duration. Val Haste grants you 31% attack speed. Val Grace grants you 34% dodge, attack, and spell. Running these two together is more important for Toxic Rain than Caustic Arrow, and one thing that you can do is whenever you're fighting like a map boss or a metamorph or something, you pop Val Haste and Val Grace, and then you stand in one spot, pop all your flasks, and then hold down Toxic Rain. Another random utility thing you could run is a self-cast Despair. If you don't happen to have Despair on hit anywhere, you could self-cast Despair on map bosses or other tanky enemies. Personally, I'm not a fan of this because I would rather use Spell Totem, and it feels like if you put down a Spell Totem and then you use Despair, it seems like you're doing too many actions that are not attacking, and I would rather just put down a Spell Totem and then just start attacking. With regards to Ascendancy, we're going to be using the Deadeye Ascendancy. In this Ascendancy, we have Gathering Winds, which gives you Tailwind, and 1000 evasion rating while you have Tailwind. Tailwind increases your action speed by 10%. Second, we have this Far Shot node, which actually does nothing, but it does link to 2 very good nodes. Third, we have Ricochet. Ricochet is more important for Caustic Arrow than it is for Toxic Rain, because it does nothing with Toxic Rain because Toxic Rain cannot chain. But it allows Caustic Arrow to chain 1 time, increasing our map clear, and it causes Caustic Arrow to deal 10% more damage for each remaining chain, increasing our single target damage. Finally, we have Endless Munitions, which increases area of effect by 50% and gives you 1 additional arrow fired. The 1 additional arrow fired increases the overall area where the Toxic Rain pods land, and it makes map clearing with Caustic Arrow much easier. If you decide to do Toxic Rain only in the late game, then you would take off Ricochet like this, and then you would put on Fast and Deadly. Doing this grants you 30% increased damage and 10% increased attack speed. With regards to the order in which you should get these, you have two options. The first option is, well, the first thing you're definitely going to do is to get Tailwind. Now, for the second option, you have two choices. One choice is you could decide to get Far Shot, which does nothing, and then get Ricochet to increase your Caustic Arrow damage, and then finally end with Endless Munitions. The second thing that you could do is you could instead go for Fast and Deadly first. This increases your attack speed and projectile damage early on at level 55, which is pretty good. And then when you do your third lab, you then undo this one, and then you decide to go Far Shot into Ricochet. Then finally you end with Endless Munitions. This is the endgame tree for this build. This tree is built at level 95 and assumes that you killed all bandits for 2 additional passive points. One thing I should say is that there are many different ways that you could build this tree, and there's not one correct way. You can experiment around and kind of do what you wish. This is just one variation that I like to do. Now, with regard to cluster jewels, I would highly recommend upgrading to the cluster jewel setup if you get one. In endgame, one cluster jewel setup looks something like this. You'll note that on the skill tree, 2 things happened. First, we respect these points over here, and then we respect these points over here on the Master Fletcher wheel, and then we instead connected the tree this way. The cluster jewels that we're going to use, you ideally want an 8 passive cluster jewel with chaos damage as the type, and ideally you want 3 notables on this. In SSF, this is actually surprisingly easy to do. All you need is to do aberrant fossils in 1 socket resonators over and over again, and eventually you will get 3 passives. Then you just pray that you get the good ones. For medium cluster jewels, there are 3 options that you can use. The first option is the best one, which is Chaos Damage Over Time Multiplier. This one can roll extremely good properties such as Brush with Death and Wicked Pal. The other 2 viable medium cluster jewel options is you could get Raw Damage Over Time Multiplier, and the other one that you could use is Projectile Damage. The projectile damage medium cluster can also roll some pretty good nodes that give you like 30 to 35% increased projectile damage, which of course translates into damage over time for us. And they're also very easy to craft. To craft medium cluster jewels, all you really need to do is you basically just alt spam them until you get a good one, such as a notable with damage over time multiplier, and then you regal and you pray that you get another decent one, and then it's just good enough like that. Okay, so for small cluster jewels, you want to run either 2 passive or 3 passive cluster jewels with the life type. The best notables that you're looking out for are Brush with Death, which gives damage over time multiplier and recover 1% of life on kill, and Fettle, which increases your maximum life by 10%, but is very, very rare. If you run small cluster jewels, you could either choose to run 2 of them here, or you could just not run the small cluster jewel and instead just put like a normal jewel in here. That's also pretty good. With regards to the possible 2 cluster jewel setup, this is the 2 cluster jewel setup that you could do. In this setup, we remove all the nodes up here that lead to atrophy, and we instead go down here and pick up this cluster jewel socket, and then we basically just put the same thing here. Overall, going from 0 cluster jewels to 1 cluster jewel gives you a significant increase to damage. However, going from 1 cluster jewel setup to 2 cluster jewels, it still increases your damage, but not significantly. It increases your damage by a little bit, but in order to do so, you have to have some very good cluster jewels already to do this. So it's definitely not a priority to go from 1 to 2, but you should try to refactor from 0 cluster jewels to 1 cluster jewel as soon as you can. That being said though, the build is fully functional without any cluster jewels, and you do not need a single cluster jewel in order to do all content in the game. Here is a list of notable quiver mods. One thing to say here is that the base of the quiver does not matter, but the penetrating arrow quiver is an interesting one. Early on, if you're using Caustic Arrow, penetrating arrow quiver is very useful. However, later on, if you decide to use fork support or chain support with Caustic Arrow, you then suddenly do not want to use a penetrating arrow quiver. Additionally, you can corrupt quivers to get +1 arrows fired, which is actually a pretty big deal. For this reason, I'd recommend randomly valing every decent quiver. Here is a list of decent glove mods. Additionally, there is the option to use the exceptionally rare Ascendancy Gentle Touch unique gloves. You can val gloves to get the curse enemies with despair on hit implicit, which is pretty good. I would recommend randomly valing all decent gloves until you get it. For the helmet, there are 2 mods that are pretty exceptional. The main one is nearby enemies have -9 to chaos resistance. This mod is pretty rare to get because you have to get a helmet with Hunter Influence and eye level 85, and then you actually have to roll the mod, but it is exceptionally strong. Another interesting mod that you can take is +1 to area of effect gems and also % increased area of effect. These 2 properties are on the same mod and it's just pretty good. It's not as good as -9, but it is pretty good. And if you do decide to pick this mod, you can go ahead and socket your auras into your helmet for 1 additional level on them. This is particularly good with like Malevolence. You get 1% more damage. Additionally, there are several good unique options for the helmet. The main one that is exceptional is Asenath's Chant. This is pretty rare. You have to get the Song of the Sekma prophecy, and then you have to get a Asenath's Mark, and then you can turn it into an Asenath's Chant. This is a very unique option because it allows you to trigger a socketed spell when you attack with a bow. And basically, in this game, there are quite a couple of options for spells that scale with chaos damage and chaos damage over time. Some of these are Essence Drain, of course, and then you have Contagion, and you have Soul Rend. Basically, you can put all of those gems inside of this item and it's pretty good. For belts, it's pretty difficult to get any good damage-related mods. For this reason, I just recommend using a leather belt with some good life and resistance, or a Stygian Vice with good life and resistance. Also, remember that you can use fertile catalysts to increase life, or you can use resistance catalysts to increase resistances on the belt. If you do decide to use a Stygian Vice, you have several options for the Abyssal Jewel. There are multiple different good mods. You can pretty much just use whatever you want. One of the biggest power spikes that you can get in SSF is if you get lucky enough to get a Hunter-influenced eye level 82 amulet. This item is exceptionally good because it can craft either +1 to all dexterity gems or +1 to all chaos gems. By increasing the level of your Toxic Rain or Caustic Arrow, you get a huge DPS boost. It's also pretty straightforward to craft this. I would recommend using single socket resonators with aberrant fossils to try to land +1 chaos gems. Alternatively, you could craft on -2 mana cost of non-channeling skills. You can get this mod by unveiling Elrion jewelry. Another thing to note is that if you do get lucky enough to get the eye level 82 Hunter amulet, but it's on a bad base, you can change the item to an Onyx amulet while keeping everything else the same by vendoring the item along with a red gem, a green gem, and a blue gem. For amulets, I would recommend choosing a base that has good stats, specifically strength and intelligence, and then putting on the catalyst that increases attributes. For the rings, I would recommend using either a 2-stone ring, a coral ring, or a vermilion ring. As for the mods, there are 3 mods in particular that stand out. The first one is -2 mana cost of non-channeling skills. You get this mod by unveiling Elrond jewelry. This is really good for mana sustain, especially for Toxic Rain. The second mod that's important is % increased chaos damage. You can get this mod by using Essences of Envy. I would recommend using all Essences of Envy on the best ring base that you get and pray that you get something that's actually good. The third ring that's exceptional is the Despair on Hit ring. You can get this with a Hunter influenced ring, eye level of 80, and to craft this, you will probably use 1-socket resonators with aberrant fossils. However, it could be pretty difficult to land this. For 2 stone rings, I would recommend putting on resistance-giving catalysts. For coral and vermilion rings, I would recommend putting fertile catalysts. If you put 20 fertile catalysts on a vermilion ring, you can get 8% life as an implicit. Another thing to note is that fertile catalysts will also decrease the mana cost by an additional 1 or 2 if you craft on Elrond's minus cost craft. For body armors, there are a lot of options that you can use. The ultimate armor is going to be Carcass Jack, giving 50% increased area damage and 50% increased area of effect. However, it could be pretty difficult to farm this, although there is a div card that will give you Carcass Jack. It's called the Scavenger. Another interesting armor that you could use is Cherubim's Maleficence. I don't believe you can farm this, so you'll just have to get it from a random drop, but it does increase your chaos damage and life by quite a bit. Finally, one of the best defensive options for TRCA in SSF is Kintsugi. Kintsugi is special because not only does it greatly decrease the chance that you get one shot, but it's also very easy to get. In order to get this, all you need to do is chase down the Deadly Rivalry Prophecy chain, and in the final prophecy, you will defeat a rival exile who will drop Kintsugi. Or you can just use a rare with decent life and res. For the boot selection, there are 2 boots that stand out. The first one is Bubonic Trail. You can get Bubonic Trail by killing the Lich in Abysses. Bubonic Trail is interesting because it gives you Deathwalk. Deathwalk is an ability that causes corpses around you to explode as you walk. This is particularly good for Toxic Rain because you can shoot the rain, then you can walk through the rain, and then enemies around you will explode. It greatly increases your map clearing ability. The other boot that is very good is Atziri's Step. You can get Atziri's Step by fighting Atziri, which you can access by putting 4 Val fragments in the map device. Atziri's Step is exceptionally good because it grants you 16% chance to dodge spell hits, along with a very high amount of base evasion. Alternatively, you could simply use a 2-tone boots with high life, high movement speed, and resistances. Doing this in some cases is desirable to using one of these unique options because it allows you to be more greedy with your other items. With regard to bows, here is a list of various bow mods that are very good. You want to be using a Thicket bow base because it has the highest base attack speed. Alternatively, there are several uniques that you can use as well. So in order to optimize your damage, you're going to need to use the best possible bow that you can use at all stages of your journey. Here is a list of important eye level thresholds for bow modifiers. To start off, when you're leveling, you're going to want to see if you can randomly pick up a bow with eye level 9 or above with +1 bow gems. This will greatly increase your Caustic Arrow and Toxic Rain damage early on while leveling. As soon as you can, you should upgrade to an eye level 64 Thicket bow with +2 bow gems. This is pretty easy to get and generally only requires maybe 50 to 100 alterations if you're lucky to get it. Finally, as soon as possible, you should try to upgrade to a 6-link bow and then try to craft some endgame worthy mods onto it. There are a couple ways to get a 6-link bow in SSF. First, obviously, you could just randomly throw fusings on it. Sometimes it's good to do this. You can also save up 1500 fusings and then 6-link it guaranteed using the Delve recipe. You could also farm the Imperial Legacy Div card. This card drops from Desert, Desert Spring, Dunes, Pillars of a Rune, and also foothills in Act 9 if you decide to farm there at a low level. The ideal bow to use is a thicket bow because it has the highest possible base attack speed. Alternatively, if you are using the Imperial Legacy method, you're going to get a 6-link Imperial bow, which only has 0.05 less base attack speed than thicket bow, and it already comes 6-linked, which is huge for SSF. So the easiest way to craft a +3 bow in SSF is using fossils. In order to do this, you're going to need a 3-socket resonator, and in the resonator you're going to put corroded, metallic, and jagged. By doing this, you can see that we have isolated the only available prefixes to be +1 to level of socketed gems and +2 to level of socketed bow gems. This means that if you use these 3 fossils together, eventually you're going to get a +3 bow. Pretty easy. Additionally, if you have a 4-socket resonator, you could toss in a serrated fossil. Doing this increases the chance that you get a good suffix, such as attack speed, and bow attacks fire 1 or 2 additional arrows. However, this decreases the chance that you get damage over time multiplier, so you can do that if you want. So the next method to craft a +3 bow in SSF involves metacrafting. And the main idea here is to use the cannot roll attack mods modifier, which is obtained from the Plague Maw 5 prophecy. If you look at all the available prefixes for bows, you will see that all of them have the attack metamod tag, except for +1 to level of socketed gems. This means that if you craft cannot roll attack mods and then fill up all the suffixes and then Exalt Slam, you're guaranteed to hit +1 to level of socketed gems. So let's run through a test scenario of crafting this. So to start off, what you're going to do is you're going to alt spam until you get +2 to level of socketed bow gems. Now you're going to craft an additional suffix onto it if you can with an augment. Say you got some random suffix like this. Now you're going to drop a regal. At this point, it's very important that the regal gives you an additional suffix. If the regal gives you an additional prefix, you have to start over. So now you have a rare bow with 1 prefix and 2 suffixes. At this point, you're going to manually craft on cannot roll attack mods. This costs 1 exalt. Then you're going to Exalt Slam the item to guarantee +1 to level of socketed gems, like this, because it is the only available mod without the attack metamod tag. At this point, you can remove cannot roll attack mods, and then you can craft on an additional prefix or an additional suffix. The prefix that you want is 40% to chaos damage over time multiplier. You can get this mod from unveiling random items. If you don't have this, you could instead craft on attack speed or anything else that you think is good. This leaves you with 1 empty prefix or 1 empty suffix, depending on what you want to do. And then you could either spend an additional exalt to fill that in, or you could just save that exalt for later, which is what I would recommend doing. So in summary, this is a pretty good way to get a +3 bow with 1 additional desirable property. It only costs 2 exalts, and it's pretty good, pretty simple as well. So the next method to craft a +3 bow involves 3 exalts and has a couple of prerequisites. First, you're going to need the multi-mod craft, which can be obtained from defeating the Pale Court. Second, you're going to need the +2 to level of socketed support gems craft. This can be obtained from unveiling items after defeating Katarina in the Syndicate. If you have these requirements, then it's actually pretty simple. What you're going to do is you're going to start off by alt spamming for +1 to level of socketed gems. At this point, it does not matter if you have an additional suffix or not. So let's just pretend that you didn't have an additional suffix. Now you're going to drop a Regal Orb, and say the Regal Orb gives you another suffix like this. If you already have a suffix from alt spamming, make sure that the Regal gives you another suffix. If you already have a suffix in your Regal and it gives you a prefix, you have to start over. So now you have a rare item with a prefix and either 1 or 2 suffixes. At this point, you can go ahead and craft on your multi-mod. This costs 2 exalts. Now you're going to craft on +2 to level of socketed support gems. This costs an additional exalt. Finally, you're going to finish with crafting on 40% to chaos damage over time multiplier. And then you're done. So the final method to craft a +3 bow is one that involves 7 exalts and possibly a couple of annuls. However, it's guaranteed to give a good result. So what you're going to do here is first you're going to alt spam until you get +2 to level of socketed bow gems. At this point, you need to make sure that your suffix is empty. If you happen to have a suffix, you have to annul it off. This may take a couple tries. Once your bow looks like this, you can proceed with the next step. Now you're going to drop a Regal to get an additional suffix, maybe this. At this point, you're going to manually craft on multi-mod, and then you're going to craft on cannot roll attack modifiers. This costs a total of 2x for multi-mod and 1x for cannot roll attack mods. Now you're going to drop an Exalt Slam to guarantee +1 to level of socketed gems. At this point, you're going to remove all of your crafted modifiers, and then you're going to craft on multi-mod again for 2 exalts, and then you're finally going to craft on chaos damage over time multiplier, and then you're going to finish with crafting on attack speed. Depending on which attack speed tier you want, this may cost an additional exalt. The highest tier of attack speed craft does cost 1 exalt. So with this method, yes, it is expensive, but you guarantee a bow with 40% chaos damage over time multiplier, +1, +2, and attack speed. And then maybe you got a lucky suffix from regaling as well. For anointments, here is a list of several anointments that you can use, which use different oils. The best anointment here is Corruption. Corruption grants large increased chaos damage and also increases the effect of Withered. This actually boosts your damage by quite a bit, assuming that you are using Spell Totem with Wither. The other interesting anointment to mention is Exceptional Performance. Exceptional Performance does very little for Caustic Arrow, but by increasing skill effect duration, it greatly increases Toxic Rain's single target DPS. However, I'm personally not a fan of that because it doesn't really increase mapping speed that much. However, if you are standing in one spot for, say, over 2 seconds and shooting Toxic Rain, this will result in a significant single target damage boost. Other ones that you could get are Atrophy, which is pretty decent, although it's worse than Corruption. Early on, you could get Master Fletcher. It's pretty cheap and gives you attack speed and damage. If you have a Silver Oil, you could also pick up Dirty Techniques. Here, the only useful mod is 10% damage over time multiplier, but it is pretty good. Alternatively, if you want Area of Effect, you can decide to pick up either Amplify or Blast Radius. Finally, during leveling or early mapping, when you don't really have any valuable oils, you could pick up either Path of the Hunter or Aspect of the Eagle. For flasks, there are a couple of decent cheap flasks that you can use. Quartz Flask is good because we do rely on dodge, and also it gives you phasing. Jade Flask is good because we are an evasion-based character. Silver Flask is mainly good for Toxic Rain, but it does give you 20% increased attack speed while you are using Toxic Rain, which is pretty good. Basalt Flask is decent in general for 15% additional physical damage reduction, and then Quicksilver Flask, of course, to grant increased movement speed. There are also a couple of unique flasks that are worth mentioning. The primary one is Witchfire Brew. You can usually get this pretty easily by spamming Ancient Orbs on legendary flasks. Witchfire Brew grants you increased damage over time as well as a level 21 Despair Curse aura. This can greatly increase your single target damage to enemies that are standing next to you. However, if possible, I would still prefer Despair on hit. The second option is Dying Sun. You can get this from killing Shaper. This allows you to fire more projectiles, which is good for both Toxic Rain and Caustic Arrow, as well as giving increased area of effect. The third option is an interesting one. It's Cinder Swallow Urn. This does two things. First, it allows you to recover life, mana, and energy shield on kill. Second, it states that enemies ignited by you during Flask effect take 10% increased damage. Interestingly enough, a hit of fire damage with damage equal to 1 is technically capable of inflicting ignite. Therefore, if you can get a little bit of fire damage somewhere in your gear, you could get some pretty good value out of Cinder Swallow Urn. You can get this by killing Katarina in the Syndicate. Finally, you have Bottled Faith. You get Bottled Faith from the Cortex map by killing the boss. It's pretty rare, but it is pretty good. The main property that is interesting here is Consecrated Ground created during effect applies % increased damage taken to enemies. And that's pretty much it for my Toxic Rain / Caustic Arrow Deadeye build guide. If you made it this far, I want to say thank you for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave a comment. I will try to respond to it, and yeah, I will catch you all around. So at this point, the guide is officially over, but for those interested, I'd like to present a couple of possible tree variations. The first variation that you could do is if you want reduced mana reserved, maybe if you have mana issues, you want to run a higher clarity or something, you could take Charisma. In this case, you would identify the worst nodes in the tree, which is probably these here. You take this off, and then you can get Charisma to get 8% and then additional 4% reduced mana reserved. Could do this. Another thing you could do is take Pierce. To take Pierce, you would take this node here and this node here. This two nodes gives you 20% increased projectile damage and pierce an additional target. Early on, this is pretty good for Caustic Arrow because it increases the pierce of it, basically. Early on, when you don't really have chain or fork, you can run this, and it greatly increases your map clear speed. Another thing you could do if you choose to run fork support with Caustic Arrow, which I like to do, you can take these nodes like this, and this gives you a little bit of projectile damage and 50% reduced fork angle. This is pretty important because I find it very hard to hit enemies if you don't have this 50% reduced fork angle node. But if you have this, your map clear becomes totally insane. And then finally you end with Split Shot. 50% chance to fork an additional projectile. If you decide to use chain support with Caustic Arrow, you can instead do this and go for Trick Shot. Trick Shot increases the total damage of your projectiles for each time that they have chained. If you have 3 chain, 2 from chain support and 1 from Deadeye Ascendancy, your final arrow does 60% increased damage, which is pretty good for map clear. Additionally, you have these 2 intermediate nodes, which increase chaining range. This is actually pretty significant. If there's a map that's like kind of empty and you have these 2 nodes, you're just going to chain the entire screen and it's going to be totally absurd. You could even run these chain nodes together with fork like this if you want to. However, if you do decide to run fork or chain together, I would not recommend running any pierce. I would not recommend taking any pierce from the tree, and I would greatly advise against using a penetrating arrow quiver. This is because of projectile behavior. Projectiles first pierce, then fork, then chain. Running fork and chain together is fine. because you shoot the first enemy and then the projectile explodes to create a puddle and then forks 2 additional arrows. Those 2 additional arrows, if they collide with an enemy, they will create another Caustic Arrow puddle and then they will chain to a nearby target. So you can pretty much clear entire screens using fork and chain together. However, if you add pierce into that equation, if you pierce an enemy, then the projectile continues traveling. And if you, for example, target the ground, as you do with Caustic Arrow, a lot of the times the arrow will just hit the ground, fizzle out, and do nothing. In order for you to trigger fork with pierce, you have to manually aim the arrow and skewer 2 targets. The arrow will then pierce through the first target, hit the second target, and then it'll fork out of the second target. But if you don't hit the second target, it does nothing. And this is especially difficult because we're playing Deadeye. We're using endless munitions to gain an additional projectile. As a result, it's very hard to skewer 2 enemies together. So I would make sure to remove all pierce from your build before using fork or chain. Another variant that you could do is the truly softcore variant of this. So if you wanted to sacrifice your life for more damage, you could instead take these projectile damage nodes up here, like this, and then you would undo these life nodes over here. If you really don't care about dying and you just want to kill stuff as fast as possible, I would recommend doing this. And then you can even take this node, Aspect of the Eagle, because it's very close by. Another thing that I have seen people do, which is a little bit different from this tree, is you would not go down here, and you would instead go for the life wheel over here. So for instance, you would go here, you would take this damage over time node, you would get the socket here, go here, take Profane Chemistry for life, then you would go up here, and you would take Exceptional Performance along with these 2 little nodes here, for a total of 45% increased skill effect duration. This is more significant for Toxic Rain than Caustic Arrow because skill effect duration scales Toxic Rain damage significantly against single targets, assuming they stay in the area of effect. Then you go over here for Sentinel, Elemental Resistances, and then finally you traverse over to the life wheel and you take all the life nodes that you can take. This is another way to play the skill tree. And then in addition, since you are already here, might as well go over here and take these life nodes as well, and then end with Fury Bolts here. And then optionally, you could go down here and take this life as well. Something like this. This is just abstract. You know, obviously I'm way over skill points, but you could do something like this, and then maybe you can remove these skill points up here. Maybe this increases your life by a lot. In my experience, doing this is not really worth it, at least in softcore, because you do decrease your damage by quite a bit by going over here, and it doesn't increase Caustic Arrow's damage that much. And you don't really lose too much life anyway by just going over here and just taking these nodes and running these points elsewhere. Also, you lose area of effect because then you don't get these nodes. But this is an idea. This is another way that you can build the skill tree. Another thing that you could do is if you did decide to go up here, and if you happen to get like a really good glove corruption, like Temporal Chains on hit or something, and you have Despair on hit, you can take Whispers of Doom. This is the benefit of pathing up here, is that you have access to Whispers of Doom with just a 4-point investment. If you can find 4 points to give to here, you can apply an additional curse, which is pretty good. Or you could anoint this for triple golden. Another little optimization that you can do, if you don't decide to take these life nodes over here, instead of linking the skill tree over here, you could link it like this, and then you gain 10 additional strength, which could be a couple more levels on your red gems, and it gives you a tiny bit more life. Could do this as well. Going back to the default skill tree, there are also a lot of random little nodes that you can take that are actually surprisingly potent. There is these 2 nodes here. The first one gives 16% increased projectile damage, and the second one gives attack speed projectile damage. It's pretty good. You could also take this node here for 16% increased damage over time. I mentioned this before, but you could take this node for damage and area of effect. You could take these 2 nodes for 15% increased damage over time apiece. They're not that bad to take. So basically, there's a lot of random little nodes that you can take that are actually surprisingly good if you have the odd skill point that you can't really seem to fit anywhere. And I think that pretty much covers the skill tree and a couple of variations that you can do.